Majora's Mask has gained this reputation as being the dark, depressing, odd one out iteration of the Zelda franchise. Well, in terms of its theming. Sure, it deals with some pretty heavy themes of loss, but there is so much more to Majora's Mask being different than just its subject matter. I know the development history has been covered to death at this point, but it's important to the discussion at hand. After Ocarina was released with universal success, a sequel needed to happen and fast. So Majora's was rushed out the door in just a year with the same assets and a smaller team. To avoid making a copy and paste of its predecessor, Nintendo had to get creative, which led to the dark atmosphere, the time mechanics, and what I want to talk about, the dungeons. We all know Zelda Dungeons typically follow the same structure. Go into dungeon, solve puzzles, beat mini-boss, acquire an item, finish the dungeon with said item, and defeat the boss, typically with the item in question. When A Link Between Worlds came out, it was seen as a breath of fresh air into the way the franchise works. Renting items and using them to access dungeons allows for a more open experience of play. By choosing the order you wish to tackle most dungeons, rather than walking down a predetermined path, really it gave a modern shape to the classic Zelda 1 formula, rather than revolutionizing the way Zelda games can be played. Majora's Mask does as much, if not more, than any other title at shaking up the way we look at dungeons in the Zelda franchise, but doesn't seem to get that credit because it's too busy carrying the burden of being the brooding teenager. So when you think about Majora's Mask dungeons, it's usually just the ones needed to summon the 4 giants, and technically that is true, but the items you get in each temple are all just iterations of the fairy bow. So yeah, Woodfall Temple falls into the cliche formula. But after that, the game opens itself up to a world of new possibilities. Since the main dungeons are just bow and arrow related, this means all other staple items are found outside each temple and are also a task to get, but in the best possible way. This resulted in as much puzzle solving and effort required as they usually are in dungeons of previous and later games. The game cleverly eases you into this, however. The build up to Woodfall Temple is a bunch of little tasks that at the time feel small, but when you add them up, it's the effort you'd expect from any dungeon, just with no restricted space and through unconventional means. So the pre-Woodfall quest has Link go to the Woodfall Swamp, find the entrance to the woods, follow the monkey, find the downed witch, go back and get a potion, help the witch, take her boat tour to the palace, solid snake around the gardens, buy the magic beans, use the beans outside the palace, go across the top of the gardens, get the song Sonata of Awakening, and then fight your way to play the song to raise the dungeon from the poison swamp. Well, that's a lot of shit for just entering a dungeon. Compared to, say, Ocarina, which is very basic and it's find the sword and grind 40 rupees to enter the Deku Tree. As you go on through the world of Termina, the quests that lead to each dungeon get longer and more intricate, but never tedious. The game tricks you into doing more tasks and creating these ever longer quest chains that lead to each dungeon. The Pirate's Fortress and Akanya Canyon may as well officially be the game's 3rd and 5th dungeons, as they each have items midway through that are used to defeat the boss at the end. But the game doesn't present them that way. Because the game needs you to awaken the 4 giants from the real temples, these between dungeons don't feel as urgent as they should. They're just set up as a means to get the songs required to enter the next temple, which is the genius of it. Majora's Mask is padded in such a way that you can do 2 dungeons, the long quest chain and the real temple, with each 3-day cycle, rather than having you go through the cycle 8 times for progression. As I said, other Zelda games touch on the whole doing things before the next dungeon, but for the most part they're pretty simple, and part of a more grand adventure. Little tasks that get in the way before the more important parts. Meanwhile, Majora's is a very compact and concentrated experience. It expertly weaves it all into a package that feels very coherent. Every moment has weight to it. Using the Ocarina example again, getting the hookshot is a simple task of going to the graveyard and beating Dampe at a race. It doesn't feel like a huge quest, but a simple task before taking on the Forest Temple. While getting the hookshot in Majora's is a long ordeal of traversing Great Bay in order to gain entrance to the Pirate's Fortress, then taking down the entire pirate army to make your way to the treasure at the end, all while also collecting the Zora eggs needed. Now think back, how is each boss defeated in Majora's Mask? It's a combination of masks and your sword, not the item you got for taking down the mini-boss. The items received mid-temple start with a fairy bow, which is pretty typical, but once Snowhead Temple comes around, things start changing. The fire arrows are added to your arsenal for taking down evil. You see, in the other 2 3D games to feature magical arrows, they were underutilized. With Majora's Mask, all the magically tipped arrows are used as temple progression tools, a means to finish those second half dungeon puzzles. Every temple is built around the design of every arrow. Fire arrows melt ice to clear a path, make stepping blocks with the ice arrows, and flip a dungeon with the light arrows. In Wind Waker, the special arrows are required, but serve more as a progression check rather than a means to complete specific tasks. You can't acquire them until you've saved your sister and gotten the Ballad of Gale's song. After getting the fire and ice arrows, you just use them to enter Ice Ring Isle and Fire Mountain. There are means to make sure you don't skip ahead and keep you where you need to be. Since Majora's Mask puts its main items outside of traditional dungeons, it allows a more satisfying sense of discovery. Since you're not restricted to the walls of a temple, upon gaining a new item, you're free to just play the Song of Soaring pretty much right away. Go explore previously unreachable areas and grab some collectibles along the way. While I do think the long quests between temples do count as a dungeon-like experience, the nature of them allows for the uniqueness of Majora's to shine through yet again, with a more openly explorable world. Miyamoto wanting to create a short Zelda game, something that could be completed more quickly than in the past, but inspired the player to replay the game over and over, getting a more in-depth experience each time, kind of like a movie. This statement from a translated interview seems to be what led to the openness of Termina's design, and how we got the long pre-temple quests which fit that so perfectly. And personally, I didn't notice how padded out the game is for some years. A great execution of a shorter experience that gets deeper every time you play it. A very tight time limitation on a game's development cycle is a very risky move, but when you pull it off and just get crazy with it, the results are very creative. Skillful and masterful padding under a strict deadline can significantly boost the game's playtime, without the feeling of getting bloated from too much boring content. And Majora's Mask proves that this can lead to one of your strongest and most beloved games in the series.
Look at the sky, it's turning red.